The night started like any other. I was deep in sleep, completely unaware that my quiet, suburban life was about to be turned upside down. At exactly 3:17 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud, blaring alarm. My heart skipped a beat as I heard the screeching sound of tires burning rubber outside my window, followed by flashing blue and red lights bouncing off my bedroom walls. I stumbled out of bed, half awake, trying to make sense of what was happening. What I saw when I looked outside didn't make sense at all. Armed officers were storming the street, radios crackling with commands, moving with the kind of precision I'd only seen in Hollywood movies. I had no clue what was going on. But that wasn't the real shock. The real gut punch came when I looked down at my Jeep, my pride and joy, only to find it missing. In its place was a bright orange parking cone with a sticky note attached to it that read, "Code violation. HOA confiscated." My stomach dropped. I couldn't even process it at first. I had parked my Jeep right in front of my house, following the exact instructions I'd received from the local police task force. It was supposed to be a safe, legal spot. But now, my Jeep was gone. I ran outside in a panic, only to be greeted by the unhelpful sight of Karen, the HOA president, and the woman behind this mess, smiling smugly from behind the scenes. Little did she know, she had just messed with a federal operation, and the consequences were about to be much bigger than she could ever imagine. The problem? She had no idea what she had just done. Karen Farthington was the type of person who couldn't mind her own business if her life depended on it. Known around the neighborhood as Karen Supreme, she had built a reputation for being a control freak who micromanaged every detail of community life. If you made even the tiniest mistake, she was there with a fine or a complaint. It didn't matter if it was something as small as a lawn being a half-inch too tall or Halloween lights still up after November 1st. Karen was the self-appointed enforcer of all the rules, and woe to anyone who dared to step out of line. It wasn't enough for her to keep things in check. She had to make sure everyone else was following her idea of perfection too. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about Karen's quirks. If you dared park a car in your own driveway for more than a couple of days, she would write you a notice. If your trash cans weren't placed in exactly the right spot, you'd find a warning pinned to your door. No one wanted to cross her. And honestly, the whole neighborhood had learned to tiptoe around her constant scrutiny. But when I moved into Willow Creek Estates, I didn't know that a simple Jeep and a small mistake were about to bring me face to face with the full force of her obsessive control. It all started with my Jeep. I parked it out front one morning after following the instructions I had received from the local police task force. The thing was, my Jeep wasn't just any off-roading vehicle. It was outfitted for law enforcement use, with blacked-out windows, military-grade plating, and a bunch of covert surveillance equipment inside. But to Karen, it wasn't anything special. The first time she saw it, her face twisted into a look of disgust, as if she'd just seen a rat in her kitchen. "That doesn't belong in this neighborhood," she said, glaring at it like it had personally insulted her. "It looks like it escaped a demolition derby." I tried to explain that the Jeep was part of a special project with the local police, but Karen wasn't having it. She looked me up and down, snorted and said, "Nice story, soldier boy. Next time, try a Honda like a normal person." Her words stung, but I kept my cool. I knew better than to argue with her. Besides, I had bigger things to focus on. But Karen didn't just let it go. She started sending me weekly letters, complaining about everything from the Jeep's military look to what she called excessive tactical aesthetics. I even got one for parking intimidation, as though a parked Jeep could somehow mess with the minds of my neighbors. It was clear Karen wasn't going to back off, and the more she pestered me, the more she seemed to zero in on my Jeep like it was her personal mission to rid the neighborhood of it. What started as a mild annoyance quickly turned into an obsession. Every week, I'd come home to another complaint about the Jeep. It was like Karen had nothing better to do than make sure my vehicle was the biggest problem in her life. Little did she know, she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life by messing with something much bigger than a simple eyesore in the neighborhood. When I first moved into Willow Creek Estates, I thought the biggest problem I'd face would be adjusting to a new neighborhood. But what I didn't expect was to become a part of a covert police operation right in my own driveway. The truth was, my Jeep wasn't just a rugged off-road vehicle for weekend adventures. It was a key part of a police sting operation. The local law enforcement had asked me to use it as a fixed surveillance post to monitor a drug ring that had been sneaking into our supposedly peaceful community. They had outfitted it with hidden cameras, GPS trackers, and a digital recording system, essentially turning it into a high-tech spy vehicle. The plan was simple. I would park the Jeep in a place where it wouldn't attract attention, and law enforcement would use the footage to monitor the suspects. The task force had given me very specific instructions. I couldn't just move the Jeep whenever I felt like it, and it had to be positioned in a certain way to get the best angle for surveillance. Every few days, I would slightly adjust its position, keeping everything under wraps and ensuring that the operation stayed secret. The more I followed these rules, the more I realized how important the Jeep was to this operation. The last thing I wanted was for someone, especially Karen, to mess it all up. But that's exactly what happened. Karen, of course, didn't know any of this. She just saw a big, military-looking Jeep sitting in front of my house, and in her eyes, it was an eyesore that needed to be dealt with. Despite the fact that I had explained it to her multiple times, she wasn't having any of it. Each week, she would send me new complaints, each more ridiculous than the last. Her first complaint was about the Jeep's excessive tactical aesthetics, and after that, it was complaints about the lock I had put on the wheel. To her, it wasn't just a vehicle. It was a personal challenge to her authority. The more I explained, the more she dug in her heels. I was getting frustrated, but I couldn't afford to get into a fight with her. I wasn't about to let one person ruin an important operation, so I just followed the rules even more strictly. I added a heavy-duty lock to the wheel, making it as clear as possible that the Jeep wasn't some abandoned vehicle, but Karen didn't care. Every time she drove by, she'd shake her head or mutter something under her breath about how ridiculous it was. I kept my cool, reminding myself that this wasn't just a neighborhood issue. This was bigger than her petty complaints. But Karen wasn't done. She wasn't satisfied with filing complaints anymore. She decided to take matters into her own hands, ignoring everything I had told her. One afternoon, I was out running errands when she showed up with a tow truck in tow, literally. She called a private tow company, one that didn't ask too many questions, and marched up to my Jeep. Without hesitation, she pulled out a set of bolt cutters and snapped off the lock. It wasn't just a violation of the HOA rules anymore. It was a violation of something much more serious. She had just taken a government surveillance vehicle without any authority. What she didn't know was that by doing this, she was not only breaking HOA rules, but also sabotaging months of work that law enforcement had put into this operation. She didn't realize it, but she had just jeopardized everything. And by the time I got home, my Jeep was gone, leaving nothing but a parking cone and a sticky note from Karen, declaring it confiscated. The worst part? She had no clue about the consequences she had just triggered. Karen had clearly had enough. After weeks of complaining and getting nowhere, she decided it was time to take matters into her own hands. She called a tow company that clearly didn't care about the legitimacy of her actions and arranged for them to come pick up the Jeep. But that wasn't the worst part. Karen wasn't content with just calling the tow truck. Oh no, she took it a step further. She showed up herself, carrying a pair of bolt cutters, and marched right up to my Jeep like it was just another thing to control in her little suburban kingdom. With no hesitation, she began snipping the heavy-duty lock I'd put on the vehicle, completely ignoring the fact that it wasn't just some junk car. It was a key piece of a federal investigation. What made the whole thing even more absurd was the fact that Karen seemed to think she was completely justified in doing this. As she cut the lock, she muttered something about how the Jeep was an eyesore and how it needed to be taken care of for the good of the neighborhood. She had no idea what she was dealing with. And to make matters even better, Rick, my neighbor, was on his porch that afternoon with his Ring camera rolling. He had seen Karen pull up with the bolt cutters, and knowing how Karen had been acting, he decided to record the whole thing. Rick wasn't one to let anything slip by unnoticed, and this was about to become a key piece of evidence. When Karen finished cutting the lock and called the tow truck, Rick had the whole thing on video. He caught Karen's smug expression as she stood over the Jeep, looking proud of herself as she called it, one less eyesore in the neighborhood. To her, this was just a victory in her war against anything that wasn't perfectly in line with her idea of suburban normalcy. But to the rest of us, well, it was about to turn into something much bigger. When I finally returned home later that day, I noticed something was off. My Jeep was gone. At first, I thought maybe someone had stolen it. After all, it had a big, obvious lock on it, so it seemed strange that it would just disappear. But as I walked closer to where I had parked it, I saw it. A bright orange parking cone with a note stuck to it. My heart sank when I read the note. Code violation. HOA confiscated. It was signed by Karen. My blood ran cold. My Jeep wasn't just stolen, it had been towed by the HOA, and there was no way in hell this was legal. I immediately knocked on Karen's door, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of the situation. But of course she didn't answer. Instead, she sent me a formal email, as if she was doing something perfectly reasonable. In the email, she explained that the HOA had taken action to remove an abandoned vehicle from the neighborhood to preserve community standards. I could hardly believe it. She had taken my Jeep without permission, and now she was trying to act like she was doing me a favor. That's when I realized I needed to call in the big guns. I reached out to the police task force, explaining the situation and letting them know what had happened. I knew I was dealing with something much bigger than a petty HOA dispute. The Jeep wasn't just a car. It was a key part of a law enforcement operation. And Karen, in her ignorance and obsession, had just destroyed months of hard work. Within half an hour, Officer Melendez and a few other officers showed up at my house. The seriousness of the situation was evident in their faces when they heard the details. Officer Melendez was particularly stunned when I told him Karen had cut the lock off a government vehicle and towed it without authorization. His disbelief turned to anger as he realized the full extent of what had happened. This wasn't just a neighborhood issue anymore. This was obstruction of justice. My Jeep was a piece of federal property, and Karen had tampered with it, not realizing that by doing so, she had essentially destroyed a large-scale surveillance operation targeting a dangerous drug ring. The weight of it hit all of us. Karen's actions weren't just a nuisance anymore. They had real, legal consequences. The task force was already discussing how to handle the fallout, and it was clear that Karen's little HOA mission had turned into something much bigger than she could ever have imagined. The search for my Jeep started the moment the police task force realized what had happened. They immediately began an urgent search to track down the vehicle, but the problem was, it wasn't just sitting in a normal tow lot. Karen had clearly gone off the rails, taking the Jeep somewhere private, away from the official channels. As the minutes passed, the task force realized they had no idea where she had taken it. They checked every local tow yard, every impound lot, but there was no sign of the Jeep. The officers were getting frustrated, and the tension was mounting. Every second counted because the longer the Jeep was out of sight, the more it put the entire operation at risk. As the police scrambled, the stakes grew higher. The surveillance operation they had been running for months was at risk of falling apart. The drug ring they had been monitoring had started to get suspicious. The suspects, who had been carefully watched by the Jeep's surveillance equipment, were now on edge, and the task force feared they might go into hiding or change their patterns, making it impossible to catch them. The longer the Jeep was out of commission, the harder it would be to track the criminals. The entire investigation was hanging by a thread, all because Karen decided to take matters into her own hands without understanding the consequences. Every minute that passed, the tension in the room kept building, and the realization of what Karen had done was starting to sink in for everyone. Meanwhile, Karen remained completely unaware of the mess she had caused. She still thought she had done something good for the neighborhood, oblivious to the fact that she had just sabotaged a multi-month federal investigation. To her, the Jeep was just a nuisance, and getting rid of it felt like a victory. She had no idea that her actions had far-reaching consequences. The police were starting to see the full extent of the damage. They weren't just looking for a missing car anymore. They were trying to fix a broken operation, one that had been years in the making. The legal consequences of tampering with federal property were beginning to become crystal clear, but at that moment, all the task force could do was search and wait. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the police located the Jeep. It wasn't in some regular tow lot, as they'd hoped. Instead, it had been dumped in a shady private impound lot, a place no one would have thought to look. And to make things worse, it wasn't just abandoned. It had been stored there under Karen's watchful eye. It turned out that she had set up her own private towing operation, completely unauthorized, and had been running it without any official approval. The Jeep was there, sitting among other vehicles she had towed, but it was a mess. The exterior was scratched, the surveillance equipment inside was completely destroyed, and the carefully set up systems were now useless. The damage was devastating, not just to the vehicle, but to the investigation itself. Officer Melendez couldn't hide his frustration when they found the Jeep. The damage was worse than they thought. It wasn't just a simple car theft. It was a complete disruption of an active operation. The surveillance system that had been monitoring the drug ring was ruined, and now all the work the task force had done over the past few months was essentially for nothing. As the officers began to assess the situation and figure out their next steps, it was clear that Karen had no idea what she had done. Her petty crusade against the Jeep had spiraled into a full-blown legal disaster. But the worst part was, she still didn't understand that what she thought was a simple neighborhood cleanup had just jeopardized the safety of an entire operation, the lives of undercover officers, and possibly even the community. After the damage was done and Karen's actions began to unravel, she decided to call an emergency HOA meeting. This wasn't about admitting fault or trying to make amends. No, Karen was hoping to clarify things, to spin the story and make it look like she was doing the right thing all along. She sent out an official notice, calling it a chance for the community to gather and discuss recent concerns about neighborhood safety. Of course, the real reason for the meeting was to defend herself. She was determined to present herself as the victim in all this, trying to make everyone believe she was just trying to protect the neighborhood from a potential threat. As Karen walked to the front of the room, clipboard in hand, she wore that all-too-familiar smug look. She tapped the microphone twice, as though she were preparing for some grand speech. "I want to address the recent incident involving the removal of an illegally parked vehicle," she started, her voice dripping with sweetness. But it wasn't long before her defensiveness started to show. She claimed that she had acted within her rights, that she had been misled about the vehicle's ownership, and that the Jeep was simply too much of an eyesore to stay in the neighborhood. She even tried to twist the narrative, making it sound like the community should be thanking her for stepping up and taking action. It was clear she was trying to justify her behavior, avoiding any responsibility for the mess she had caused. Then, the moment of truth came. The protagonist stood up, and with the eyes of the whole community on him, he walked up to the front of the room. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and showed the board the video footage from Rick's Ring camera. The video clearly showed Karen cutting the lock off the Jeep, looking straight into the camera with a grin on her face as she proudly called for the tow truck. The room fell silent as everyone saw the truth for themselves. But that wasn't all. The protagonist then pulled up Karen's Facebook posts, where she boasted about her actions. One post even described her successfully cleaning up the streets, making it clear she was proud of what she had done. The evidence was undeniable. At that point, Detective Sasha Lynn, who had accompanied the protagonist, stepped forward. Calm but firm, she explained the serious legal implications of Karen's actions. She explained that by tampering with a government vehicle, Karen hadn't just broken HOA rules, she had disrupted an ongoing federal investigation. Sasha laid out how Karen's interference had compromised months of surveillance work, costing both time and resources. She also made it clear that Karen's actions could lead to charges for obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and potentially more. As the room listened to Sasha, the weight of the situation became clear to everyone. Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. After the evidence was laid out for everyone to see, Karen's days as the HOA president were numbered. The board didn't waste any time. In a tense, charged atmosphere, they voted to suspend Karen from her position, citing her unauthorized actions and the damage she had caused. The decision was almost unanimous, and the room felt like a weight had been lifted. The community was finally rid of the iron grip of someone who had taken her authority way too far. But Karen wasn't just being suspended from the HOA. The legal consequences of her actions were starting to unfold. The police were preparing to press serious charges against her. She was looking at possible criminal charges for tampering with federal property, obstructing a law enforcement investigation, and even misusing HOA funds for personal gains, like paying for her rogue towing operations. As the legal team got to work, it became clear that Karen wasn't going to just lose her position. She was going to face real consequences for what she had done. Outside the HOA, the public reaction was swift and unforgiving. News of Karen's actions spread like wildfire, especially when Rick uploaded the footage of her cutting the lock to Reddit. The video quickly went viral, and soon enough, memes and videos mocking Karen flooded social media. People were turning her into the laughingstock of the internet, and the more people shared her story, the worse her reputation got. Karen, the once feared HOA queen, became a symbol of petty power and entitlement. The community, which had been living under her thumb for so long, finally felt like they had their freedom back. No longer did they have to worry about fines for small infractions or dread the passive-aggressive notes on their doors. For the first time in a long while, it felt like the neighborhood belonged to the people who actually lived there, not to someone who used her power to control every little thing. The internet's mockery of Karen only added fuel to the fire, and she became an overnight joke, not just in her neighborhood, but across the country. The more people laughed, the more Karen's authority crumbled, and she was left with nothing but the fallout from her own actions. Karen didn't take her fall from grace quietly. After the board suspended her and the police began looking into charges, Karen tried to fight back in the only way she knew how, by filing a countersuit. She claimed that she was the one who had been wronged, arguing that the police and the neighborhood had somehow entrapped her. Her argument was a stretch, to say the least. She tried to turn the whole situation around and make it seem like she was the victim, claiming that the Jeep had been improperly parked, and she had every right to remove it. But the court wasn't buying it. Her case was quickly dismissed, and Karen found herself facing even more legal trouble. The charges against her for tampering with federal property, obstruction of justice, and misuse of HOA funds continued to pile up, and it became clear that not only was she going to lose her battle with the law, but she was also losing her place in the community. Her reputation, once built on control and fear, crumbled. People who had once feared her now saw her for what she truly was, a petty dictator who abused her power. And as the legal system closed in, Karen's personal and professional life started to unravel. The once untouchable woman had become a symbol of entitlement and failure. With Karen out of the picture, the neighborhood began to transform. For the first time in years, the residents felt empowered. The HOA, which had long held the community in a chokehold with its endless rules and fines, was dismantled. People could now park their cars without fear of getting fined for the smallest infractions. Lawns didn't have to look like they were freshly cut every weekend, and the fear of Karen's looming presence was gone. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now felt free to make their homes their own, to express themselves without worrying about Karen's judgment. There was a sense of relief in the air. The community that had once been held hostage by one person's obsession with control was now a place where people could breathe again, where real community and neighborly bonds began to thrive. It felt like the neighborhood was finally back in the hands of the people who actually lived there, and it was better for it. For the protagonist, the end of Karen's reign was a hard-earned victory. Not only did he get to enjoy the peace of a liberated neighborhood, but he was also gifted something that truly symbolized the change: a new space, a community garage. The task force, recognizing the role the Jeep had played in the operation, gave him legal ownership of a small, unused lot that had once been used as Karen's private towing operation. The protagonist turned it into a community hub, a place where people could come together to work on their cars, bikes, or any projects they had, free from the fear of fines or HOA interference. The Jeep, once a symbol of Karen's oppressive control, now stood proudly as a community landmark in front of the garage. It wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It had become a symbol of the community's victory over petty power, a reminder that sometimes one person's overreach can bring a whole neighborhood together. In the aftermath of Karen's actions, her legal fate was sealed. She faced multiple charges and was forced to leave the community. Her reign of terror over the neighborhood came to an end, and in the wake of her departure, things slowly started to improve. With her gone, the residents began to rebuild the sense of trust that had been lost. People started looking out for one another again, forming stronger bonds and working together to prevent anyone from misusing power in the future. The change wasn't instant, but over time, it became clear that the neighborhood had become a much more positive place to live. Looking back, it's clear how one person's abuse of power could have such a huge impact. Karen had the ability to manipulate, control, and hurt people simply because she held a position of authority in the community. Her actions showed just how fragile systems of trust and respect can be when someone uses their power for personal gain. But it also highlighted the resilience of the people around her. They didn't let her break them. Instead, they came together, learned from the experience, and emerged stronger. The police, too, took this as a lesson, realizing how easily power can be abused when left unchecked. It was a wake-up call that systems need to be constantly monitored, and communities need to speak up when things aren't right. As the protagonist drove the Jeep one last time through the neighborhood, he felt a sense of relief. Justice had been served, but there was also a weight lifted. The neighborhood was safer, people were more connected, and he had a great story to tell. It wasn't just about the drama or the chaos that had unfolded. It was about the lessons learned and the way everyone had come together to right a wrong. And as he drove off, he couldn't help but smile, knowing the community had finally found its way back to peace.